Officer Walters encountered an elderly black woman, unaware that one impulsive decision would change everything. That night, his actions set off a chain of events that shook not just his life, but the entire city. What followed would shock even the most experienced. Officer Mark Walters was patrolling a quiet neighborhood on the city's outskirts when a radio call came in. Suspicious person by the store, been sitting there for over an hour, causing concern. Walters, accustomed to responding swiftly and decisively, knew from years on the force that even seemingly harmless situations could escalate into something serious. He pulled up to the store and spotted the elderly black woman sitting on a bench near the entrance. She had a bag on her lap and looked completely peaceful. But for Walters, that wasn't enough. His instincts, sharpened by years of service, told him that anyone could be a threat. His internal biases only heightened his suspicion. Slowly stepping out of his car, Walters approached the woman with a stern expression. He walked so close that his shadow blocked out the evening streetlight, casting a dark shadow over her frail figure. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply, his voice devoid of any greeting. The woman looked up at him with calm eyes, though there was a hint of weariness. "Just resting," she replied calmly. This response didn't sit well with Walters. He saw an elderly black woman before him, and, guided by his internal stereotypes, he was convinced something wasn't right. "Show me your ID," he demanded abruptly, giving her no time to think. The woman quietly placed her hand on her bag and began searching for her identification. Her movements were slow, as if time itself had slowed down. Maybe it was due to her age, but Walters, clenching his fists impatiently, took her slowness as disrespect and defiance. "Stop stalling!" he barked, his voice dripping with aggression. Walters felt his irritation rising. Without waiting for her response, he grabbed her arm, twisting it with a sharp motion. The woman cried out in pain, and before she could explain herself, he forcefully pushed her, striking her in the face. She lost her balance and fell onto the cold pavement. A crowd of bystanders began to gather, shocked by what they were witnessing, and people started recording the incident on their phones. Walters froze for a moment, realizing that the situation was spiraling out of control. The elderly woman slowly got up, pain evident on her face, but she said nothing. Instead, she calmly pulled out an ID from her bag and handed it to Walters, who was now far less confident in his actions. As he glanced at the ID, he saw 3 letters that flipped the entire situation upside down: FBI. Officer Walters paled, his hands trembling as he realized he had just assaulted a federal agent. The crowd around him grew larger, and the phones kept recording every moment of his disgrace. Walters stood there, unable to tear his eyes away from the badge that bore the bold letters FBI. This wasn't just any ID. It was the official identification of a Federal Bureau of Investigation agent. His blood ran cold, and his legs felt like jelly. He immediately grasped the enormity of his mistake. The crowd murmured in disbelief, their voices rising as they witnessed the unfolding drama, while the phones captured every second. "What have you done?" the woman said coldly and calmly as she stood up. Her face was serious but composed, as if this wasn't the first time she'd faced such situations. The blow had left a red mark on her cheek, but she showed no sign of pain. Her voice carried more reproach than fear. The crowd continued to grow, with people loudly discussing what they had just seen. Some began shouting their anger. "You hit her for nothing!" a voice rang out. "That's racism!" another person yelled. The air buzzed with tension. Walters nervously glanced around at the onlookers, realizing that there was no easy way out of this. Panic started to grip him. He tried to explain. "It was a misunderstanding. I didn't know." But his voice no longer carried the confidence it had moments ago. The woman, meanwhile, confidently looked at him and said, "You didn't just abuse your power. You did so based on bias, and there will be consequences." She calmly put her ID back into her bag, signaling that his fate was already sealed. With every passing moment, the crowd grew more restless. People shouted accusations at Walters, demanding justice. "That's police brutality," someone cried. "Justice for all." "Racism is not the law," others yelled. Walters realized that this was not just an unfortunate mistake. He had become the symbol of racial bias and police brutality, sparking widespread outrage. As backup arrived, Walters knew it would not be enough to contain the fallout. His entire career, his years of service, could be over because of one wrongful punch and his own prejudices. The video of the incident spread rapidly across social media. Within hours, news headlines screamed, "Cop beats elderly woman, an FBI agent, and racist incident shocks the city." The footage garnered thousands of views and comments, with people expressing outrage and demanding justice. Television channels brought in experts to discuss racism in law enforcement. In every broadcast, there were angry discussions about systemic discrimination and police brutality against black people. The story of how an elderly black woman, an FBI agent, became the victim of a baseless attack quickly became a symbol of a much larger public debate. Under intense pressure, Officer Walters was temporarily suspended, pending an investigation. His superiors tried to calm the public by promising that the matter would be dealt with swiftly and that justice would be served. But those words were not enough to quell the growing wave of protests sweeping through the city. People took to the streets, demanding police reform and accountability for Walters. Signs with phrases like "justice for all," "racism is not the law," and "police brutality must be punished" appeared on City Hall and police precincts. The protests, especially within the black community, were loud and massive, reflecting long-standing grievances over bias in law enforcement. The woman involved in the incident remained silent publicly, but her status as an FBI agent only added weight to the situation. Her silence further fueled interest in the case, with the public clamoring for answers. Walter's position grew increasingly precarious. His colleagues distanced themselves from him, knowing that his career was likely over. Some at the department avoided speaking to him, understanding that his days in the force were numbered. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Walters realized that his future in the police force was in jeopardy. Every detail had been documented, and the footage showing him striking the elderly woman filled every news outlet. Society, as well as his colleagues, were waiting for a verdict. The woman, whom Walters had assaulted, eventually issued a statement. Though brief, it was powerful. She revealed that she had been working undercover on a major corruption case involving local officials. The incident with Walters had disrupted part of the operation, but more importantly, it had exposed the deep-seated prejudice within law enforcement. Her words became a rallying cry for the public to demand change. Walters was called into a meeting with his superiors, where he was informed of the internal investigation's findings. He was found guilty of abuse of power and racial discrimination. The verdict was harsh: immediate termination, with all privileges associated with his years of service stripped away. But Walters' problems didn't end there. Civil suits from the woman and from civil rights organizations soon followed, demanding not only punishment for Walters, but also comprehensive police reforms. Many within the department began to realize that this case was not an isolated incident, and that urgent changes were needed in how officers dealt with minority communities. The city became engulfed in heated debates. Authorities announced reforms, promising to overhaul police training, with a greater focus on combating racial discrimination and upholding human rights. Activists and representatives of the black community pushed for transparency and accountability in law enforcement. As for the woman, she continued her work with the FBI, but her name became synonymous with the fight against racial injustice. Her speeches and the community's support led to the formation of grassroots initiatives advocating for justice on a larger scale. This case became not just an isolated event, but a catalyst for systemic change. For Walters, this incident was a devastating blow. His resignation cost him not only his job, but also the respect of his former colleagues and the community. He tried to justify his actions to himself, saying that he had followed protocol, but deep down, he knew that his biased judgments had led to the tragic consequences that cost him his career and dignity. Ultimately, this incident showed that no one, no matter their rank or position, is immune to accountability for their actions, and it reminded everyone that real change starts with every choice we make.